My name is Vickie Neuman, and we have been doing this Web3 series this morning on, and Richard Burgess and I at the outset really decided, we really feel like indie labels are quite well poised for things in Web3. And we talked about fan engagement this morning, monetization, and now we're going to talk about rights in Web3. Some of the takeaways from this morning were really that you may have a million fans for your artists across all the different platforms now. And the idea is to port some of those. Maybe it's not a million, maybe it's 100 that are true fans that you can engage with more meaningfully in Web3 and monetize those. And so this is really the last of the puzzle pieces, which is the rights. And how do we actually enable money to flow beyond getting consumers to find a meaningful enough experience to open up their wallets? How are we going to make this work in the world that we know now about metadata, fragmented rights, publishing and master recordings? And we have some really, really great thought leaders and experts in the field to talk about that today. So let's do introductions first, and then we'll get into it.
Hi, my name is Daan Archer. I'm from the Netherlands, from Copyright Delta. And we do two things. First, we do data analytics on royalty statements. And we've built a boring banking blockchain for music licensing. Yep. Yes.
Oh, that's it?
Yeah.
That's the whole shebang?
We're just doing introductions.
Oh, okay.
So just tell people who you are.
All right. I'm Rich. I work for Revelator. I'm an analog native, but I started my digital experience in 1995 at a website called SonicNet. Went to Web 2 at an e-commerce company called CD Now in the .com era, and then what maybe a lot of you might be more familiar with in the Web 2 era, the digital distributor IOTA, and then I did licensing at Ardio and Pandora up until recently, and now here I am, and then my friend.
Hey everyone. Ooh, that's a hot mic. My name is Matthew Maxwell. I work in the business development team at SoundExchange, and the main focus is to figure out new economic and social verticals to add value to the creative community, particularly like what I'd say the 95%, the DIY space particularly. Prior to SoundExchange, kind of had a hybrid of a background, a mix of Wall Street and music production, and I run an independent label based out of DC, so using Web3 in the indie community is pretty tantamount and important for me, so excited to talk about these topics with everyone.
That's great. So when blockchain first burst onto the scene, it's probably been 10, 12 years. Every time there's new technology, technologists oftentimes look at the industry and say, "This is great. This is going to be the perfect way. Nobody will ever need a label. Everything will happen now between the artists and fans." And then that always proves to be false. There were a lot of early ideas around blockchain being a licensing mechanism, being a way to have metadata fixated on the blockchain. But now what I think we're seeing is with the advent of the experiences that are being built on Web3, we are actually seeing applications, real world applications, and using the blockchain for specific purposes and helping things change hands. But let's talk a little bit more about what each of you are really doing, because we have this existing world of Web 2 where we have ISRC codes and ISWC codes, and money and data is all machine readable, so according to those identifiers. How are you bridging the world that we are entering with Web 3 versus this world that we're existing in now?
Can I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I should have added, I've been a software developer for 20 years. So first I did 10 years of artificial intelligence. And the past 10 years I've been doing data sovereignty and data analytics. And in between I've also been a technology diplomat for the Dutch government in Japan. So I'm okay with bridging those worlds between Calvinism, capitalism, and consensus building. So if we go to blockchain technologies and Web3, why I'm in it, what I like about it, is that if you look at the past 25 years, we were all focused on getting data over the line. Great, but now all data is in Google and Silicon Valley, and our data is being sold back to us. With Web3, in my perspective, the possibility there is that suddenly we can have proof of ownership of data and get paid for data, so correctness of the data, which was that missing link. But then if you add blockchain to that, I would say there's two types of blockchains, how you can look at that. So there's public blockchains and there's permission blockchains. We're in the permission field. Very briefly about public chains. Say Bitcoin, Ethereum, that's a different use case. That's a virtual currency that does not exist. To have trust in that, everything needs to be fully transparent, and more than 51% decides every 10 minutes left or right. If you look at IP licensing, it's about ownership. So if all of you are owners of rights, you should decide who has access to your data. Only you decide. So what we've built is a boring banking blockchain network that has vaults, and everybody can control their own rights, and you decide what to share with whom. So imagine you have an Excel file, and row A2, you decide to share it with somebody else. That's your decision. And so we see ourselves as a utility, as a facilitator. We're from Holland. We're like a small country, social democracy, and fits the mindset. And we're also Calvinists, so we don't need to have access to your data. We just want to earn a microcent per transaction. So we always thought somebody has to be willing to build a utility layer.
And I think there's a really good point that you brought up, open and permission blockchains, because that is also something, you know, almost every financial institution, almost every bank is experimenting with blockchain, but they are not open. Of course, if they have our data, if they have our financial information, they're not going to make that open to the public, but they are using permission blockchains, so they're closed. And that is something that I think in this industry, transparency is you know, it's a double-edged sword, because some people want it and some people don't. And the biggest stakeholders oftentimes do not want certain levels of transparency, even to the, you know, like even to the splits in ownership of a composition. And so there are, you know, there's, you know, I think it's complete unrealistic pipe dream to think that the entire music industry is going to transition into an open, you know, unpermissioned blockchain. And so I really appreciate you making that.
Can I steal one more sentence?
Yeah.
And then to Rich, maybe? So I think what we need is transparent processes on closed data. Because again, it's your rights. You decide who has access to that. Yeah.
Well, what you were just talking about is perfect, because we're working on 2 private development projects, one with a PRO in Europe, another with a global music publisher, you know, not public projects, but we're talking about what data is going to be, you know, do these publishers want public on a blockchain? Splits, who are the writers and whatnot. That doesn't jive, right, with, so you have incumbents who are trying to tell, like, you know, to redefine what the blockchain is right now. This is going to be problematic. I don't know how we're going to solve it, but these are issues that we're going to come up to.
If I can add the permission aspect to that, but maybe after Matt.
I mean, I think the conversation was kind of lending itself nicely into what we do at SoundExchange. I mean, how we're thinking about Web3 and this ecosystem is really like threefold. There's the underlying metadata itself, right? So sound recording, musical work data, all the accompanying rights types that are then associated with that data. But a huge part of that is the migration element. So we're in a Web 2 ecosystem, but if the data from a Web 1 world to a Web 2 world isn't clean, you're going to end up having the same issues and the same reverberations of difficulties with ownership tracking, keeping track of movements and catalogs, songwriter splits, and those things. So a huge thing that we're trying to do is just to be a part of the conversation as new technologies are developing, to say, you know, here are the issues that we're presently dealing with in the Web 2 world. How can we mitigate some of these? But then additionally, what is really cool and valuable from a royalty payment side, which is what we obviously do for like the 114, is that if there is a good faith attempt holistically by the industry and we can rally people together to bring about some type of authoritative databasing and databasing strategies, we can really mitigate some of the windfalls that occurred, or shortfalls, I should say, in the Web 2 world. And so we're really trying to bring as many parties to the table as possible to hopefully get to the heart of some of these issues and determine, at least in transparent processes, even if there are private, you know, permission-based networks, still making sure that the underlying data for the file types on-chain in the smart contracts are authoritative and are reputable for every company and every individual that's going to come into this space seeking to add value in some, you know, type of way.
I think it's a great point to talk about the world that we have now, and then mirroring that in blockchain and finding those bridges, because in the existing world, we have silos of data sitting all over the world that don't exchange with each other. So there's incorrect information. There's probably about $1 billion a year that never makes its way. It's monetized and that doesn't make its way into the rightful owners in both the sound recording and the publishing side. And this occurs, neighboring rights, this is mechanical rights, performance rights, and it's because of bad data. And blockchain can be slow and it can be expensive. So it's not necessarily a great use case for microtransactions of what we know in streaming, and probably that would not work. But the permanence of data is something that we desperately need in the industry. And so what does that look like? I mean, you're doing a lot of different partnerships in Europe. Is there motivation and incentive for people to clean up the data and to find a better solution than having silos and databases?
Yeah, we're starting to work with a few societies, distributors, DSPs, and also in Web3. We have some funding from, for example, Avalanche, the big layer ones, who also want to go into the future. And they're like, hey, can we help clean up the gaps of the past? Maybe about data and rights and splits. So it's almost that, see, the rights somebody owns. The data is a link to those rights. So it's almost like if you have control of your rights, then the data can be public, because it's more about who owns the rights. And then on the splits part, this is where we look at how can we connect public change with private change. Some parts are private, splits, how much money do you make? We work with all these Dutch DJs, and they make loads of money. They own 200% of their rights. And, but they don't want the world to see how much money they make, or what is the split. So if you have a bad split, you get a bad deal with a major. You don't want the world to know that. But you do want to have proof of payment. So that's why we're also talking, how can we work together? Because all blockchain should work together in that sense. And so rights, data, splits, some parts are public, some parts are private. And as you said, in the end, it's about proof of payment, proof of correct payment. And that's why we like to work with incumbents, because what you're doing for so many years, we can't do that. Somebody needs to build a connecting glue.
Well, Revelator's sitting in between here as a, starting out as a Web2 digital distributor that has spent 4 years developing 5 APIs that built 3 utilities for, wallets and NFT galleries and whatnot. But we can allow our rights holders to create, tokenize their royalties, create splits, assign those splits to other, to other people. Eventually, you'll be able to, monetize that by creating loans against future royalties, stuff like that. This is all future stuff that's, the other panel before this is brilliant. But we're working on stuff that's 2, 3, 4, 5 years away, while still managing a, a Web2 digital distribution business.
Yeah, we're operational though. And
as are we.
And what you mentioned about the incentives that we see, like for example with societies. So in blockchain technology, you have something called a verified credential. And if you look at the supply chain, you have an author, a society is a member. The stamp of that society is gold in a digital value chain at the end from a DSP, because then you can prove the correctness of the rights. So our pitch to societies is, you can be very important here because you are a root of trust. You exist on behalf of law. For us as tech people, that's gold. We're just a utility layer. So that's what we see, the positive feedback there.
And let's talk a little bit, and I want to start with you on this, is that in a blockchain-based world, it's smart contracts, right? So you know exactly who is contracting with whom and what those terms are. Do we need identifiers? Does that require ISRC codes and ISWC codes, which is what we have now, which is kind of this albatross around the industry because ISWC codes and ISRC codes don't match up. This is why there's money that never gets transformed. But do we need to reflect ISRCs and ISWCs on the blockchain?
I think that's a great question. I would say in this period, what I would call like a great migration, I would say yes. Because we kind of need that link from where we are to where we're going. That being said, if I'm kind of getting more future focused and just thinking about what the world might be able to look like, I mean, ideally, every performer, artist, publisher, label has some type of unique identifier that then is the codification of their work, of their labor, of their legal arrangement with any given WAV file, MP3, or whatever future file types would then come up and emerge. So there's a way, I think, where having a smart contract, having things on a chain in such a way where a unique identifier could route back to the original ISRC code, but there could be a world in which there might be a new type, and the new type is, I'm working with Dan on a record, and the identifier is whatever my ownership is within the Web3 kind of world. And that would be a really cool, I mean, I'm kind of nerding out on the sci-fi elements, but this would be a really cool element of what the future could hold to also minimize the many different types of identifiers that we presently have in existence. Almost making it like, you know, if I swipe a credit card at any type of grocery store, it's routing directly to, I mean, my banking institution, but it's a direct one-to-one transaction in some senses. So that's kind of what's attractive, I think, for us as we're looking at what this could mean. But I do think the history would need to be a part of the whatever the archives become as we move into this Web3 world in the future.
Can I add to that? From a software side, identifiers are so important. 27 ways to write Whitney Houston, just one identifier. And connect IPIs, IPNs, ISNIs, ISRCs, all wonderful, but it's super key. Like your data set of ISRC is amazing. And we want to connect to that because then we can optimize systems. Yeah. I heard Spotify, they have with 100 million songs, they probably have about 130 million ISRC codes. All those double ones, how can we quickly filter that out?
Triple ones,
Yeah.
quadruple ones.
When we have this world that we're living in where we have literally hundreds of stakeholders between labels, publishers, and performing rights organizations and CMOs, everybody has different systems right now. I mean, some are like card catalogs and Excel sheets. Some are PDFs. Some are DOS systems. Some are advanced databases. How can blockchain be this great unifier across everyone who's in kind of different states of technical readiness?
Yeah, I believe by allowing everybody to stay in control of their data, but by being interoperable. So it's like controlled visibility and never force everybody to be fully public. We don't want that. Nobody wants that. In our perspective is, I see, for example, Verify Media in the room. It's like companies like that who provide services to information what we do, that's super valuable because then we can have like ecosystems where everybody can make money. There's plenty of money to be made in the whole industry if we get connected, yeah, and allow people to have their own independence. For example, if you look at Barcelona, the Catalan community there, everybody's independent, but everybody works together. And the music companies there, they're all independent, but they all work together. So kind of have that as a mental framework for that.
Well, SoundExchange has been one of the best companies that is an example of like when they have collecting money and they can't figure out who to pay it out to. You know, they're not keeping that private. They're announcing, we have this money, we don't know who it is, going to showcases and going to the bands afterwards and saying, register at SoundExchange, we have money for you. I think motivation is an enormous part of this because we do have stakeholders who are not motivated to solve the problems. But I think, you know, talk a little bit about, you know, how, you know, what SoundExchange is thinking about all of this.
Yeah, I mean, going back to like earlier days with South by Southwest conferences, we literally put up like wanted posters around with the artist's name on it to say like, this is how much money that we'd like to give you, please come find us. But there's a lot of internal like mission orientation, motivation that we have to make sure that actually occurs. But going back to one of the initial questions on kind of elements of interoperability within this, I think it's so important for Web3 and blockchain-based companies because they are on the kind of future focus as they're looking to work with more Web2-based entities to kind of have an ingestion system that allows for the different types of file types and ways of engaging and harnessing data from PROs, publishers, because in all likelihood it's going to be very challenging to change systems that have been at work, because that would then affect the entire life cycle of how they're working their business. But if new tools and newer companies are building ingestion tools where if you have an Excel file, a JSON, something built in SQL or whatever language, but you can ingest and pull that content, you know, then you're putting back out what this now looks like in a newer file type. I think it incentivizes older models then to slowly, you know, begin this, I keep calling it this great migration process. And that's kind of what we're, you know, thinking about and looking at. And the biggest and the most attractive parts of it is the speed of the potential payout in royalty processing that could be improved through Web3 and kind of blockchain-based tech. So.
I love the metaphor of the Great Migration, because I'm thinking of Africa and, you know, all of these, you know, like all these animals that go across the country offering different speeds. Some of them move together, some of them move independently, but they're all ultimately trying to get to that same location.
Yeah, and another analogy I'll give, I love my grandma, I hang out with her all the time, but it's a pain point for me when I go to restaurants and there's only QR codes. She doesn't use a phone. So then I'm asking her a question, hey, do you still have some type of menu or paper, something that I can put in front of her? I feel like it's not that dissimilar here. That's a disparate analogy, but we're all at a different point and different relationship with it. So to have an expectation that we're all going to be able to migrate at the same pace is a bit unrealistic. But if you are a forward-thinking entity and that's what you want some level of migration to this new way of engaging, then think about the use cases and put yourself in the shoes of the PRO, of the publisher, of the label, and think, what can I do to make this as simple as possible to minimize friction? Because the more you minimize friction, the quicker people will move over to whatever you're developing and creating. So.
And really, no one should have to know anything about blockchain, which blockchain, anything
Right.
about
Right.
it. It's
Right.
really, you know, I think that we, you know, we're moving beyond the enthusiast era of all of these new technologies and into practical applications. And how can we do that where it's like, it would be like us sitting up here and debating and talking about Oracle databases. Like, no, we're not doing that. You know, we're talking about the utility and the functionality that can be built on top. What are your views about kind of, you know, changes of ownership of rights? Because this is another area that is that I've heard from both labels and publishers, resistance about using blockchain, because they say our rights change all the time. You know, catalogs get sold and artist shares, you know, writer shares get sold and performers shares get sold. How does the blockchain work in changes of ownership?
Touching that.
Oh, okay.
Rich is leaving the room now.
I didn't want to go instantly first. If you look at it from a DSP perspective, now we always have to clean up after the fact. As you said, with the $1 billion, black box royalties, that's why we do all these analytics to show the gaps. But if we want to get rid of that, we need to start rebuilding that from the top, from the bottom. Otherwise, you will always have that. And yes, that requires that you take an effort in having interoperable data and most of all connected data. And that otherwise we won't solve this. And if you look at what's happening now, so the blockchains we work with, the layer ones, Avalanche, Near. Avalanche has raised $640 million from the Andreessen Horowitzes of the world to generate this whole bunch of new TikTok 2.0s. They're all coming now. The former owners of the Trello platform are building a TikTok Foursquare. These guys have capital and they're building this platform pretty quickly, and they're all running on layer ones. And because they say we want to go into new business models, financial models, but we want to have no liabilities. And then if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, in the last 10 years we had Spotify, go to market, get to 1 billion customers. The next 10 years, I believe, is more about cleaning up the rights and going to the next phase. So the timing is good for that. But indeed, you need to have that up to date, which also instantly allows for new business models. That's why like Scott Cohen, Jukebox, those type of initiatives, there's plenty of things we can do with that. But it does require that people get registered, which is actually, we are really big fans of societies who exist on behalf of law. And many of them have a mandate at least, and they are member organizations. They have seen their members. They did the KYC. And again, it's gold. But
yeah, we have so Revelator has an experience. We did a project with Tiesto, a society in Scandinavia, and we got data from BMAT via an API, and the goal was to see if we can speed up the payment of performance royalties from 90 days, and we got it to daily in a test case. It didn't go on beyond that for various reasons because of their accountants said things that I'm just not going to get into here. But going back to societies, like there are societies out there who are progressive and who are working on things. And I think if you hitch your wagons to organizations like SoundExchange and progressive societies, I think you're going to be well served, is what I would say.
Yeah, I'll just tag in. There's kind of two types of transactions I'm at least thinking about. There's the actual changes in ownership, like changes in copyright. Then there's the additional kind of tranching or securitization even of music royalties, which is a whole other side, and in some ways that has a quicker secondary market, tertiary market.
Flow for the other?
In some ways I'd say yes. Like if I own a catalog, but let's say I'm selling off part of my neighboring rights, well, that's a very particular percentage. It doesn't really change what I own, but it would change who receives monies from that new neighboring rights royalty that's now being dispersed to the broader economy. And to me, that is where, I am very curious how the technology works on the secondary and third tier markets, especially when you have elements of, on every resale of the catalog, are there percentages included here that are meant to go to the initial issuer of what this is? And that's where enforcement of smart contracts becomes really interesting. Keeping track of those layer by layer kind of transactions there is really intriguing. But again, I think it does go back in some levels to the initial organization of the data itself, which is why I think the independent community has a really unique space within the Web3 ecosystem, because generally speaking, there may be less rights owners or different players that have shared in some ways in the development of a work, which then means you have maybe a more accurate repository of data if you're an indie label with 5 to 10 artists and you keep track of where those things are. I think this space can be really attractive for you because that is already baked into what you're doing by nature of being niche. I think where you encounter some difficulty is when your catalog acquisition rate or your artist signing rate is moving at a rate that's faster than your actual data management tools and practices actually are. And that's where I think you end up in some difficult waters when it comes to transactions of rights or royalties and things of that nature.
A lot of things in Web3 right now are very artist-led as well, which I think that's also really important because the major stakeholders, major publishers, maybe major labels, and then the CMOs, PROs, these entities that are sitting on top of millions and millions of shares, and it's very difficult. They're like a big oil tanker. It moves very, very slowly, takes big wide turns, whereas artists, independent artists, and independent labels can move much more quickly. They can engage with Web3 platforms. They can experiment with artists. They can put things on the blockchain on a small scale and be able to have these viable use cases that will prove out that, yes, this does actually work and we can keep things clean. Because I think there's reluctance in some of the big stakeholders to make that big migration with their complex set of rights, many of whom are completely private. And you have, people like Travis Scott who are creating songs like Sicko Mode with 35 writers on that song, and 10 of them are independent and they're not registered anywhere. And so we have these existing ecosystems. But how are you viewing this about adoption? Do you think that it starts on the fringes, or are you starting with the major stakeholders?
In our case, Dutch DJs, they own 200%. And they're professional.
So meaning they own 100% of the master recording and 100% of their publishing.
Yeah, and they're professional because they know we need to get registered. Otherwise, you cannot solve this. But indeed, if you then have a song with 10 artists who do not get registered, everybody creates a liability. Yeah.
Because I do think like, and I do a lot of synchronization licensing, mostly for games, but that's where I see it. And it's mostly hip hop and electronic music, where there are, you know, big songs that have hundreds of millions of streams, and there will be 2, 3, 4, 5 writers who have a share. I don't even think some of them are even writers. I think they're just people who happen to be in the room. But they're not registered, they're not a society member, they don't have anyone representing them. I've actually chased people down on Instagram and said, you know, really want to license your song, you know, how can I get to you? And it's like, oh, you know, talk to my guy over here. And so there's a cross section of creators who I think have all but given up on the way our ecosystem works, because they don't feel like it's worth the time and effort to register their publishing shares, find a publishing administrator, get to be a part of a PRO, because they just don't think there's any money there. But there's a lot of money.
That's why the two magic words in the licensing business are one stop.
Right. Well, that's essentially, Dan, what you're talking about is having you know, people who have a simpler right structure as kind of the starting point.
Yeah, start building the use cases there. And so from a software side, 100% is 100%. If you have 50 writers or 200, of course, it's a lot of work to get all that together. And
It's the human problem, though. It's not a data problem. Once you know who those people are, then it is just a matter of calculations, but it's really herding cats.
Absolutely. Technology should never be in the way. The promise of the past is that we would have more time to talk to our moms and our parents by IT. The opposite has happened. But the goal of good blockchain technology is that you would never see it. Yeah. And
What are your thoughts about where does adoption occur? Is it on the fringes?
Yeah, I honestly think it's a mix. I think early stage adoption often is on the fringes because there's less at stake to lose. And from a risk management perspective, if you're an independent, you know, kind of label or artist with maybe a more specialized or niche kind of market, the downside of maybe having a tougher initial experience within the Web3 world, the downside might not be as high on a, you know, macro kind of level. I think for us at SoundExchange, because we interface with majors, indies, and everything in between, it's really a matter of what are kind of the concerns and pitfalls of each individual stakeholder, and then trying to figure out what types of resolutions can be done. Because adoption, I'm thinking about old newer tech, I'm thinking about cell phones, computers, like all of that is usually on the fringes to some extent. Or if it's not on the fringes, there are individuals trying to kind of wrap their head around how they would engage with this in a more research R&D type of way. So for us, it's a mixture, but it's about being as readily accessible for whatever stakeholder might be there, since they're all individuals that we're paying on a monthly basis. So.
Well, and Revelator, I think, did a really good job of kind of self-selection, that in building all the tools, the wallet attracted artists and labels who wanted to have a better way of speeding up money and being able to distribute music and get access and have, you know, kind of a forward-looking view of what earnings would be. Can you talk a little bit about that, Rich?
Well, yeah, we have a unique company. We have a founder who started a label that, you know, went through Island Records in the 90s and then, you know, sped up to today where, you know, he's surrounded by developers and engineers. We're building these Web3 tools, so, you know, we can, you know, you can launch your own NFT gallery, you know, you can mint tokens in your dashboard, you know, you can split royalties, you can, you know, you can create that NFT and put it on OpenSea, or you can launch your own NFT gallery that we power. You know, bells and whistles, or you can, you know, do what everyone else is doing. So, yeah, and there's a wallet there where it's a non-custodial wallet that allows you to see, you know, your splits, your revenue from all your different, you know, your Apple, your Spotify, or whatnot, or with a deal that we just did with Tune Global. I think we announced it 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's the first NFT that sits side by side with a, you know, something on a streaming service on one of two global streaming services. So those royalties are now coming back on the blockchain to us, and then our clients will be paid on the blockchain in their wallet. Kind of revolutionary. It's, it's not going to explode today, but that's possibly one thing where things are going in the future.
But it's a great example of how
Yeah.
these worlds are coexisting. And I think that, we aren't going to see all of these Web 2 companies from, Spotify and Apple and Facebook and, Instagram. Not everybody is going to migrate to Web 3. They don't need to.
Doesn't seem likely.
No,
from
and
what
I
I
think,
understand.
why would they? They already have systems, and I think there may be some bridges, but we're going to have these two existing ecosystems for a really long period of time, and then we're trying to find out, how is efficiency? How does that change? Is it a matter of getting more people paid, getting people paid sooner, a different tool set? I think a lot about the global landscape where all of these societies around the world, they're old, they've been around for 150 years. They were never set up to be data companies. How can they concentrate on engaging artists and getting artists to register and then, kind of seed the back end to better systems so that they are not trying to hire engineers to build these massive systems, and they're not effective at solving the problems.
Yeah, personally, I think there's also a role there for the DSPs. I mean, the big tech software companies, and they can't expect creatives. I mean, we all love creatives, that's why we're here. And they can't expect creatives to become developers. So I see...
What were we doing in 2016 when we first met?
Yes, so we worked together at something called the Open Music Initiative back at Berklee College of Music.
Yeah.
And it was trying to pull in all these large organizations, which back then was a good place for people to talk about how can we...
Everybody was at the table, right?
How can we exchange data between ISRC and ISWC?
Right.
But then nobody implemented it. So there was a data agreement, but then nobody started implementing it. And I think the two of us are like, with two others, the last remaining from that period. And we've always taken some ideas from there, other ideas that we took and saw, and other projects that we didn't see work, and that's how we ended up with a solution. It's evolutionary processes.
Right, and we can't expect an independent artist,
That's
distributor, a major label, major publisher, and a CMO to all have the same motivation.
Nope.
They're all going to be coming at it from different angles. We have some time for a couple questions, and
Quick
start with you.
question though, so I love the conversation and best
Oh, wait,
practice.
he has a mic for you.
Oh, you got a mic?
Ah, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah, there you go.
Sound better. All right, so best practices, because I hear you, like moving forward, trying to keep this data on the blockchain because it actually, it makes it authentic. It's easier to transfer. It's not immutable. You can't change it, which is the future. But best practices moving forward. You got a new artist, just did a record. Let's keep it simple. One person did the beat. Another artist wrote the lyrics or performed the song, and they split everything 50-50. What platform do you go to move into the Web3 space? What's the best practice there?
I would say all three are systems. Start connecting them. Because you have multiple approaches with that. In our case, you would have your own private banking vault, and then the artist and the rights owners decide themselves who to share it with. In your case, you have wallets on Polygon. That's another approach. And then you've got SoundExchange systems, and then it depends on the different type of DSPs you connect to. So Ronald was here with Audius. There's some other type of Web3 platforms, Web2 platforms, and start connecting the dots together.
It's probably going to be more complicated before it gets simpler, because we do have, like if you're registering, you need to, PRO,
The MLC.
mechanical rights, MLC, all of these points of registration that is still where the vast majority of money is flowing. But then what are those tools that you could use internally that could enable you not to continue to repeat this over and over and over, but just open up data exchanges?
And this is also the point where the software companies have to make it easy for the end user. Steve Jobs, in 3 clicks, you should be done.
That's what I'm saying. So, you know, we're talking about, you said it, Polygon, everything's on, first of all, you got Nair, you said, that's another protocol. You said Avalanche, not to mention Polygon, not to mention Ethereum. You got all of these different ones. There's no harmony that connects all of them yet.
We
so.
developed multi-chain different projects, but yeah, no, you should be looking at, I mean, if you want to talk about distribution, like your distributor should be able to answer questions.
I feel like
and be
most
able-
distributors don't
Just
even
be prepared for,
Yeah, unfortunately, like a lot of them are not Web3 savvy like that yet.
many are not, no.
So I'm just trying to get a quick solution. But maybe there's just not one yet, man. Maybe it's just like you said, you just sort of go through all of it and start to figure it out and stay up on it.
Yeah, I think it's also going to be are there tools for internal data management versus are there Web3 based platforms that are for monetization? And so, we're still, if we think about this bell curve.
Well, I think Audius, I think you got to talk about Audius here in this example.
Yeah, well, I think if you think about the bell curve of adoption, we're still in these really, really early stages. And so we have some places, NFT platforms like we just had a panel with Audius that's, really trying to, create a different kind of engagement. Same thing with NFT platforms, pixel links. And they're all using blockchain in the back end, but it isn't we're not necessarily yet at a point where we just have these protocols that connect everything, and that's kind of this, it's not dissimilar to some of the problems we have now, where things don't talk to each other. But I think that over the course of time, we are going to see differences, not only in how we each manage the data, but also even to the most basic ways that we log in. We will in the future probably not be using passwords. We will each have an identity that will be managed completely differently online, because if you just think about passwords, that's totally broken. We probably have time for one more question if anybody has anything. Excellent. Well, I would love to have a big round of applause for these panelists.
I had